They were 2 graves into the burying when the wall of the shelter let go. Ilianvar heard it before he understood it, a crack like a spar snapping under torque, then the long tearing groan of cargo netting pulling its anchors out of frozen hull plate one rivet at a time. The patched section of the Corvelle's aft fuselage, the one the humans had braced against the prevailing wind 6 days ago, peeled open along its weld scar, and the blizzard came in through the gap like something that had been waiting politely outside and was done waiting. The funeral did not get to finish. The third grave, the one cut for the Quen navigator whose name Ilian had been asked to read aloud from the manifest, stood open and empty with the ice saw still in it, and every living thing on the burial terrace was suddenly running or falling or being knocked flat by a wall of wind that carried snow the way a sandstorm carries grit, horizontally abrasively, at a temperature that turned exposed skin into a countdown. Ilian went down on the second step. He was Veska. His people had evolved under a fat red sun on a world where the worst weather event in recorded history was a warm rain that lasted 4 days. His blood was already running thick and slow in the cold, and the wind took him off his feet the way it would take a sheet of foil. He slid. The terrace sloped toward the drop the humans called the apron, and below the apron there was 1,100 meters of nothing. And Ilian understood with a clerk's terrible clarity that he was going to slide off the edge of a proscribed world while its sky screamed. A hand closed on the back of his harness. Not a tentacle, not a grasping limb cluster, not a magnetic clamp. A 5-fingered human hand, bare to the second knuckle where the glove had been cut away for fine work. And behind it the whole braced weight of Nadia Rook, 24 years old, junior loadmaster of the wrecked ferry Corvelle, lying flat on the ice with her boot toes dug in and her other hand wrapped in the guide rope, holding a grown Veska against a 110-kilometer wind the way one holds a door against a draft. "Got you," she said, conversationally. The storm was tearing the world apart around her, and her voice had the cadence of someone confirming a line item. "Clip in. Left hip. There you go." His 6 fingers found the carabiner. Muscle memory from 6 days of human drills did what his thinking mind could not. The gate snapped shut on the guide rope, and the universe stopped trying to delete him. Along the rope line, through the white chaos, he could see the others, the survivors of the Corvelle, what was left of her 31 souls, clipped and crawling and being herded back toward the breached hull by 3 human beings who moved through the lethal wind as if it were heavy. Traffic, an annoyance, a thing you planned around. That was the part Ilian could not file anywhere. 6 days on this world, and he still had no category for it. The cold was beyond the design tolerance of every species aboard. The air at this altitude held 2/3 of the oxygen any of them had evolved for. The wind, when it came down off the ice cap, could plane the paint off a hull. And the humans, the smallest delegation aboard, 3 of them, one of those 3 lying broken in the medical bay they had built out of crash couches, the humans treated all of it as a checklist. "Pim," that was Tova, the Quen structural tech, her voice gone shrill and ragged. "Pim, where is Pim?" The child had been holding her mother's hand at the graveside. The wind had decided otherwise. Ilian saw a small gray shape tumbling along the terrace, limbs too long and too light, hollow Quen bones built for a gentle world giving the storm everything it wanted, and he saw the drop beyond her, and he heard at least 4 species begin to scream in at least 4 languages. Nadia Rook did not scream. She did the arithmetic. Ilian watched her do it, watched her flat gray eyes track the child's slide, watched her glance once at the rope, once at the anchor point, once at the wind-scored stretch of blue ice between her and the drop. Then she pulled the quick release on her own carabiner, unclipped from the only thing holding her to the world, and went after the child across open ice with the storm at her back. She did not run upright. She ran low and crabwise, body angled into the wind at a degree that should have been a fall, using the gusts the way a sailor uses a current, and when the wind shifted a point, she dropped flat and slid the last 8 meters on her belly, deliberately, faster than the child was sliding, and caught Pim's harness at the lip of the apron with one hand while her ice axe came down through the crust with the other. The axe held. The 2 of them stopped, spread-eagled, a meter of slick blue ice between 4 small boots and 1,100 meters of gray air. For a moment, the entire terrace was nothing but wind. Then Nadia's voice came down the line, carried in the lull between gusts, pitched to be heard and nothing more. "Ellie, throw line." And Eli Masur, the human medic, already had it coiled, because of course he did, because the humans had run throw line drills on the second day while everyone else was still weeping over the dead, and the weighted bag landed within a hand span of Nadia's shoulder on the first cast, and 90 seconds later the loadmaster of the Corvelle walked back up the burial terrace through the blizzard with a Quen child clipped to her chest harness, and the look on her face was the look of someone returning a dropped tool to its drawer. She handed Pim to Tova. She had to peel the child's fingers off her parka strap to do it. The small gray hands had locked there with the absolute grip of a creature that had decided somewhere in the slide that this surface was the one surface in the universe that did not move. Inside, Nadia said to everyone. Burials postponed. Wall first. That was the whole speech. Ilian wrote it down that night in the margins of his atlas annotations because he was an apprentice of the Meridian Atlas and writing in margins was the only prayer his profession had ever taught him. Burials postponed. Wall first. 11 words shorter than the funeral rite it replaced, and he could not shake the sense that it was somehow the more religious of the two. The Corvelle had been a charter ferry. That fact still sat in Ilian's chest like a swallowed stone. Not a survey vessel, not a cordon runner, not one of the armored hulls that licensed crews took into prescribed volumes. A ferry. 31 passengers and crew on a standard arc between two unremarkable systems, a route flown 900 times a year, and a navigation cascade had dropped them out of corridor with a dying drive above a world that every chart in civilized space marked with the same black glyph. Closure 10, Meridian Atlas object veil, crossing prohibited, landing prohibited, approach prohibited. Not because anything lived there that would eat you, nothing lived there at all above the microbial, but because the world itself, in the dry language of the Atlas that Ilian had spent 3 years learning to write, presented an environment incompatible with sapient survival across all registered physiologies. Ilian had personally inked that exact phrase onto 4 Worlds entries during his apprenticeship. He had never once wondered what the phrase looked like from underneath. It looked like this: a high continental plateau at the altitude where weather is born, 5,000 meters of elevation wearing a permanent cap of ice, air pressure that made every breath a transaction with a hostile bank, a daytime high in this season of 30 below by the human scale Nadia used, a nighttime low she had stopped announcing because the numbers were doing damage to morale. Wind that came in 2 flavors, the steady katabatic river that poured off the ice cap every night, and the storm cells that walked across the plateau like patrolling giants, one of which had just torn the patch wall off their shelter. And the season was turning. That was the arithmetic underneath all the other arithmetic. Captain Aldous Bren, flat on his back with a shattered pelvis and a voice like gravel in a tin, had laid it out on the second night with a navigator's bleak economy. Vale's orbit was long, and its axial winter was coming. And in roughly 20 days the plateau would enter the season the old survey logs called the long white 6 local months of storm without meaningful break. Anything on the plateau when the long white closed would stay on the plateau until it opened. Rescue was a word the survivors had stopped saying by day 3. The Corvelle had dropped out of corridor unobserved. Her emergency beacon's transmitter array had been on the section of the nose that was now a debris fan 2 kilometers long. The beacon's heart, the core, a sealed 9-kilo cylinder that generated the distress signature, had survived. Intact. It simply had nothing to shout through. It sat in the snow-floored cargo bay like a relic, and the survivors of the Corvelle slept around it the way ancient peoples had slept around fires that had gone out. They rebuilt the wall in 90 minutes in the storm because there was no version of waiting that did not kill someone. Ilian worked the cargo netting with his thick gloves and his slowing hands, following human instructions reduced to single syllables. Pull, clip, next, and around him the other survivors did the same. A Drosk and 4 Quen and a Hadal and 2 Ceph merchants hauling in rhythm to a human work chant that had no words anyone could spare breath for, only cadence. Inside afterward, with the wind shut out to a howl and the survivors steaming gently in the blue chemical light, the purser of the Corvelle called the meeting that everyone had known was coming. Velostrum was Drosk, a heavy world species, slab-bodied, skin-armored in plates of dull stone-gray keratin that overlapped like flagstones. Of everyone aboard, he tolerated the cold best and the thin air worst, and he had spent 6 days doing what pursers do, which was counting. He stood now beside the dead beacon core with his ledger slate in 2 of his hands, and he counted aloud. 19, he said, of 31. 3 of those 19 cannot walk and will not walk for months. Fuel for the heaters at present raw, 31 days. Food at present ration, 26 days, and I have already cut the ration twice. The long white arrives in 20 days by the captain's own reckoning. His eye plates clicked as he turned to look at the humans. And the human contingent proposes that we leave this shelter, the only intact structure within 900 kilometers. I want the full company to hear the proposal said plainly so that everyone understands what is actually being suggested. That's fair, Nadia said. I'll say it plainly. She came forward into the light. Standing next to Ostrom, she looked like a rounding error, a head and a half shorter, a third of his mass. Frostburn peeling across her cheekbones and her dark hair hacked short on the left side where the crash had taken a strip of her scalp and Eli had stitched it. Ilian had checked the manifest once, in the early days, Half convinced the humans were a juvenile cohort traveling with a guardian, 24 years, Loadmaster certificate, 3rd class. Born on Earth, and the Atlas entry for Earth was its own kind of education. But Ilian had not gotten to that yet. Nobody had gotten to that yet. This shelter is dying, Nadia said. You all felt the wall go today. That wasn't bad luck. The hull section is work hardening every time it flexes in a gust. The metal's getting stiffer and more brittle every storm, and the storms are getting worse. Second thing, we're in a slot. She pointed at the long curved ceiling, at the slope none of them could see beyond it. The mountain above us is loading with snow every day. Captain Bren's flown survey rotations on 3 iced worlds, and he put our odds of taking a slab release across this site before the long white at 1. In 3 third thing, she held up the ration tally so the room could see Ostrom's own figures. 26 days of food, 31 of fuel, and a 6-month winter starting in 20. There is no version of staying here that ends with this many people alive in the spring. Staying is not a plan. Staying is just dying somewhere familiar. The room was silent except for the wind working at the new wall, testing it, patient as a tax collector. And the alternative, Ostrom said, is dying somewhere unfamiliar. The alternative is the cordon line. Nadia nodded at Ilian, and every eye cluster and ocular plate in the shelter turned with her. Show them, Atlas Man. Ilian's hands were not entirely steady as he woke his tablet and threw its light against the hull wall. The projection that bloomed there was his own apprentice work, the survey-era cartography of Vale that he had been re-annotating in transit as a crop make-work exercise. The file that had been an academic chore 9 days ago and was now the only map of the world that was trying to kill them. Before Vale was closed, he said, it was surveyed. 40 years of cordon science on foot and by crawler before the Atlas wrote the final entry. The survey teams built a supply line of hardened shelters across this plateau, the cordon line. Bothies, the human logs call them. Stone and composite shells, half buried, rated for the long white. His light traced the chain of small black squares marching south and downslope from the wreck site. Station S7 is 11 kilometers from this position, then S6, S5, S4, each a day's stage apart, descending the whole way. And at the end of the line, on the southern rim of the plateau, at 3,800 meters, where the air is almost generous, the light came to rest on a triangle at the map's edge, Relay Post Cairn, the survey's uplink station. A dead uplink station, Ostrom said. Decommissioned when the world was closed. You have told us yourself, apprentice, the Atlas does not leave live transmitters on proscribed worlds. It doesn't. Nadia took the light from Ilian's hand gently and put it on the triangle. They pulled the power pile and they slagged the transmitter stack. But you don't haul down a 40-meter antenna mast on a closed world. You fold it and you leave it. The mast is still there. The waveguide's still there. The dish is still there, buried or not. She turned and put her other hand flat on the dead beacon core, on the 9-kilo heart of the Corvel's distress call. And we have the one piece they took away. We carry the shout to the throat. We splice this core into that mast, and every relay picket within 40 light years hears a registered emergency signature coming off a closure 10. World. That's not a maybe. Cordon law makes that signal a mandatory response event. They have to come. 90 kilometers, Ostrom said, on foot. Across that. His gray arms swept at the wall, at the wind beyond it, at the world beyond the wind. With a casualty on a sledge, a child, 3 species that have never seen frozen water outside a beverage, and a Vesca whose blood stops moving at temperatures your kind consider refreshing. You are describing a march that the Cordon Survey, professionals, acclimatized, equipped, rated as a 5-stage expedition in the good season, and you propose it now, on the doorstep of the long white. Yes, Nadia said, because your species does this. It was not quite a question. Ostrom's eye plates had narrowed to slits, and Ilian, watching, realized the purser was not being obstinate. He was being honest. He was a creature of ledgers staring at an entry that refused to balance. I have read the same manifest you have, Loadmaster. Your homeworld's classification is not a secret. I am asking you to tell this company, honestly, whether you are proposing this march because it is survivable or because your kind cannot tell the difference between survivable and familiar. The shelter went very quiet then, in the way a room does when someone says the thing everyone has been circling for 6 days. Nadia did not flinch and did not fill the silence quickly. She looked at the purser for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice had the same flat, level, line-item calm it had carried on the burial terrace with a child sliding toward the drop. Where I grew up, she said, the school bus had survival bags under every seat, and we did the drill every autumn, and nobody thought that was strange. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the cold is my friend. The cold killed my grandfather's whole trail crew before I was born. The cold is nobody's friend, but I know its face. I know what it does first and what it does second and what it lies about. She tapped the map once on the small black square of Station S7. Survivable and familiar aren't the same thing, Purser. You're right. But unfamiliar and impossible aren't the same thing either. 11 kilometers is the first stage. We can do 11 kilometers. And then we'll be 11 kilometers closer to the only radio on this planet, and we'll do it again. Ostrom looked at her, and then at the map, and then down at his ledger at 26 days of food and a 6-month winter, at arithmetic that had no column for any of this. I will be recording my objection, he said at last, in the formal log. Record it, Nadia said. Then help me pack the sledges. You're the strongest back we have. And that Ilian wrote in his margins that night, while around him 3 species worth of survivors slept badly in the groaning hull, and 1 human sat watch by the wall with a mug of melted snow, counting gusts. That was the moment the company of the Corvelle stopped being wreckage and became an expedition, not when hope was offered. Hope had been offered before by gentler voices, and it had bounced off the room like sleet. It was when the small human had answered an accusation of madness with a supply list. Amendment proposed, he wrote, to the Meridian Atlas, general notes on the human species, his stylus moving in the old formal hand his teachers had beaten into him. Existing entry reads, tolerant of environmental extremes. Annotation insufficient. Suggest addition. This species packs for them. The marchers left the wreck of the Corvelle 2 days later. In the blue hour before dawn, 15 souls on a rope, while behind them in the lit doorway of the hull the 4 who could not walk, and the one who would not leave her burned brother, stood to see them, off with the heaters and the larger share of the fuel, and a promise spoken in 5 languages. The radio first, and then you. Nobody said the other half of the promise out loud, the half with the clock in it, but Ilian could see it in every face built to show anything at all. 20 days to the long white, 90 kilometers to the mast. The last thing loaded onto the lead sledge, lashed in the place of honor like a king's coffin, was the beacon core. 9 kilos of patient, voiceless distress going to find its throat. The wind came down off the cap as they crossed the apron, and the wreck disappeared behind them into the blowing white before they had walked 400 meters, and the world ahead of them was a single shade of nothing in every direction Ilian's double-lidded eyes could reach. He was 19 years old as his people counted years, an apprentice annotator of the Meridian Atlas, the only Vesca on the manifest, and he was walking into the worst place the Atlas had ever closed, on the word of a human who checked her knots twice and the weather every hour and had never once in 6 days raised her voice. He fixed his eyes on the rope and counted his steps the way she had taught him and walked. The first lesson of the march was that there was no scenery. Ilian had braced himself, in the abstract way of a person who has read many survey reports, for a landscape of terrible grandeur. What the plateau actually offered was the inside of a lamp. White underfoot, white overhead, white in every quarter, the light sourceless and shadowless, so that the surface gave no warning of itself. Sastrugi Ridge, as hard as poured stone, looked identical to a knee-deep pocket of powder until your boots found out which one it was. Within an hour, Ilian's world had contracted to the 2 meters of rope ahead of him and the steady dark shape of Eli Massur's pack at the end of it. The humans ran the rope like a machine with a heartbeat. Nadia broke trail at the front, reading the invisible surface through the soles of her boots, calling the changes back over her shoulder in a clipped trail code the company had learned by rote. Hard, soft, ridge, hole. Eli held the middle of the line, where his medic's eyes could see the most bodies at once. Bren rode the second sledge, strapped flat, wrapped to the eyes, and from inside his cocoon of cargo blankets he still managed to navigate, calling drift corrections off a compass lashed to his chest, because a man with a shattered pelvis and 40 years of polar survey rotations was still the best instrument aboard. And every 50 minutes, with a regularity that Ilian's chronometer confirmed to the minute, the whole line stopped for what the humans called the check. The check was a liturgy, mittens off in pairs, never both at once. Each marcher inspected the face of the marcher ahead. The Quinn looked at the Ceph looked at the Drosk. Everyone looked at someone, hunting for the waxy gray-white patches of frostnip that the owner of the face could not feel. Boots wriggled. 10 toes, or 8 or 12 reporting in. Water passed down the line because, as Eli repeated with a patience that never frayed, the cold is a desert. You are losing water with every breath you can see. The first time Ilian had heard that, on day 2 at the wreck, he had assumed it was poetry. It was not poetry. It was plumbing. The humans did not do poetry about the cold. They did maintenance. Amendment proposed, he composed in his head, somewhere around the 6th check, his lips too stiff for speech. Human risk tolerance, existing entry, high, annotation misleading. Observed practice suggests the species does not tolerate risk so much as itemize it. The plateau, for its part, spent the day trying to kill them with a gentleness that was worse than malice. There was no storm. There was only the cold, the altitude, and the arithmetic compounded. Tova's hollow quin bones made her light enough to walk atop crusts that dropped heavier marchers, thigh deep, so the humans moved her up the line and used her as a sounder. Ushel the Hadal, amphibious, broad as a cargo door, hauled the lead sledge without complaint, but by mid-morning the membranous gillfolds along his neck had begun to crackle at their edges, freeze-drying in air that held less moisture than the inside of a kiln. Eli marched beside him for an hour, watching, and then took a knife to a spare thermal liner and built. In 20 minutes, on the move, with mittened hands, a crude humidity mask, a breathing tent for the neck fed by a tube from a melt flask kept warm inside Ushel's harness. It was ugly, it dripped, it worked. Ostrom dropped back down the line to study the arrangement, eye plates clicking. He said nothing, but Ilian, 2 places behind, saw him note it in the ledger slate at the next halt, in the purser's precise commercial shorthand, under a heading he had never seen a purser use, which translated, as near as Ilian could render it, to assets unlisted. Pym rode the day in shifts, an hour walking between her mother and Eli, small boots placed solemnly in the broken trail, then an hour inside Nadia's parka against her back with only her gray face out at the collar, breathing through a wool veil, watching the white world go by from the warmest address on the planet. The humans had argued for this quietly at the wreck. Tova had wanted her. Daughter on a sledge, bundled safe. Nadia had overruled her with 2 sentences. A bundle freezes and nobody notices. A walker complains, and complaining is a vital sign. So the child walked her shifts and complained magnificently and was praised for it, and by afternoon, when the cold had pressed the whole line into silence, Pym's thin running commentary on the quality of the snow, the stupidity of the wind, and the smell of Eli's mask was the only voice on the rope, and every species on it had begun to listen for it the way one listens for an engine note. That means all is well. They reached Station S7 in the last gray hour of daylight. A long, low whaleback of stone and composite drifted to the roofline. Its door a survey standard hatch at the end of a sunken entrance trench packed with 40 years of snow. Nadia looked at the drift, flexed her hands, and issued the first order of the evening. They dug. They dug in pairs in rotation. 2 shovels passed down a chain of 15 bodies, and the humans dug differently than everyone else. Not faster exactly, but with a horrible sustainable steadiness, a pace that looked lazy and never stopped, while every other species attacked the snow in bursts, and then stood gasping in air that refunded nothing. By the time the hatch wheel turned, the sky had gone to a deep arterial violet, and the temperature was dropping through numbers. Nadia had stopped, saying aloud, and Ilian's hands had reached the stage of cold that felt like wearing someone else's. Inside S7 was a tomb that wanted to be a home. 1 long room, stone-flagged, 1.5 meters of it below grade, bunk frames for 12, a squat survey stove with its flue miraculously clear. And on the shelf beside the stove, stacked with the parade ground neatness of people who had known exactly what they were leaving behind, a half pallet of survey ration crates stamped with date codes 4 decades old. Eli cracked one, sniffed, broke a biscuit, chewed a corner with the expression of a man performing chemistry, and pronounced the verdict that doubled their food supply on the spot. Stale. Edible. 40 years and still better than my academy food. It was the first joke any human had made since the crash, and it landed on the company with a strange force because Ilian realized, watching a Ceph merchant laugh until he had to sit down on a bunk frame, it was not really a joke about biscuits. It was a human looking at the Long White's doorstep and finding the situation improved. The Atlas had a phrase for worlds like Vale. Incompatible with sapient survival, nobody had told the humans, and the biscuits were on their side. That night, the stove-burned survey catched fuel bricks, and the company of the Curvelle slept warm for the first time in 8 days, and Ilian learned the second lesson of the march, which was that the humans did not sleep through a night. They kept watches, not as predators, for there were none, but against the building itself. The flue, the drift over the door, the carbon monoxide they spoke of like a stalking animal, odorless, patient, the only predator this world had ever needed. Twice Ilian surfaced from black exhausted sleep and saw the watch silhouette by the stove. Nadia, then later Eli, sitting with a mug, listening to the wind work the roof, checking the little chemical sensor strip by torchlight on the hour. He thought, fuzzily, before sleep took him back. They have made an entire civilization out of checking things. And in the morning he could not decide whether that thought had been horror or homesickness. The snow blindness announced itself an hour out of S7. On the second stage, and it chose the worst available candidate, Maro Ceph, the younger of the 2 merchant brothers. The elder lay back at the wreck with a shattered hip, which was the whole reason Maro had volunteered his back for the march. He stopped dead on the rope, both hands over his broad amber eyes, and made a sound Ilian had never heard a Ceph make. Burning, he managed. Loadmaster, my eyes are burning out. Eli reached him in 8 steps, tilted his face up, looked under the lids, and delivered the diagnosis in the tone of a man reading a parts list. Photokeratitis. Snow blindness. The glare's been sandpapering his corneas all yesterday. Seth's eyes pull in twice the light ours do. My fault. I should have cut his slits narrower. No ceremony, no comfort, just the error owned in front of the whole line, and then the fix. A strip of liner cloth, 2 razor slits, bound tight. It heals, Eli told him, guiding Marrow's hand to the rope. 2 days of pain, then it heals. You'll walk blind today. The rope knows the way. And Morrow Seth, merchant of a species whose homeworld's most dangerous geography was a tax office, walked 11 kilometers blind, one hand on the rope, while behind him a Quinn child narrated the surface. Hard, soft, ridge, hole, in solemn imitation of the human trail code, and the line slowed for him exactly as much as it could afford and not 1 meter more. Ilian walked behind them and composed amendments he no longer knew how to file. The atlas measured worlds. It had no column for this, for the discovery that the humans' miracle was not their tolerance of the cold, but their refusal to be insulted by it. The cold took Morrow's eyes. The humans bound them and assigned the child to be his eyes and kept the line moving, and at the halt Nadia crouched beside the blind Seth, put a ration biscuit in his hand and said, "You're still hauling tomorrow. Eyes are optional on a sledge harness." And Morrow laughed, blind at 35 below on a proscribed world, 9 days after a crash that had killed a third of everyone he knew. Horror, Ilian wrote in his head, because he had no other word for watching someone be taught not to be afraid of the thing that was killing him. And then, because his teachers had trained him to precision. No, strike that. Re-letter. What he had watched was not the absence of fear. It was fear, fully accounted, entered in the ledger, and made to work for its keep like everything else on the rope. The combs began without announcement on the 3rd stage. The slope steepened. The wind-polished white gave way to a chaos of pressure ridges, and Bren, flat on his sledge, took one look at the texture of the ice ahead and stopped being a passenger. "Crevassed country," he rasped. The survey called this field the Combs. Glacier comes off the cap here and bends over a buried ridge. Where ice bends, it cracks. Snow lids the cracks and the lids lie. He turned his head, found Nadia. Probe order, full intervals, and nobody unclips for any reason between here and the far moraine. The company rebuilt itself around the danger. Full rope intervals, 8 meters between bodies. Tova to the front with the probe pole, lightest on the lid, sledges spaced, Pim into Nadia's parka, midline. And then 4 hours of a procedure that Ilian would dream about for the rest of his life. Walk 3 steps behind the prober, plant your feet only in the holes her pole had certified, feel the surface answer the pole in 3 different voices. The knock of solid floor, the dull cough of thick lid, and once in a while a third sound, a hollow papery nothing, like knocking on the door of an empty house, at which the whole line would freeze mid-stride, and Tova would whisper something in Quen and find another way. They were 40 minutes from the far moraine when the lid lied to someone after all. It was not Tova. The probe found the void, the line flagged it, the line bent around it as it had been around 30 others. It was Rel, the Quen surveyor, second lightest aboard, the quiet one who had helped Ilian recalibrate the map projections by starlight at the wreck, who put his boot on the certified path, on the one place where the certified path was itself a lid, a bridge over a bridge, a lie inside a lie. The sound was soft. That was the obscenity of it. A crump like a pillow dropped on a floor, and Rel was not there anymore. There was a blue hole in the world where a person had been, a rope snapping taut against 3 anchored bodies, and a cloud of snow smoke drifting on the wind. "Line, hold," Nadia's voice, flat and enormous at once, and the rope held, because the rope had drilled holding, because holding was the only thing the rope had ever been for. The 15 bodies became one anchor. Ilian, fourth from the hole, lay where the drill had taught him to drop, axe in, full weight on it, face in the snow, and felt the rope thrum against his harness like a plucked string as somewhere below the surface of the world a person swung in. The dark. What happened next happened with a speed that Ilian only reassembled afterward in pieces. Eli anchoring a second line. Nadia going over the lip of the hole headfirst into the blue, headfirst deliberately, lamp on her wrist, because headfirst was faster and the first minute mattered most. The light dropping away under the snow. The rope signals, sharp tugs in a code older than any of their species' acquaintance. Alive. Then the long bad stillness. Then 3 tugs that meant something else, and Eli's face. Ilian saw it before the medic could govern it, and a human face ungoverned was a terrible instrument. And the slow, careful, 2-hour engineering of bringing back up through 9 meters of glacier what the glacier had already finished with. Rel had fallen clean between 2 blades of ice and stopped against a third. The drop had not been far as such drops went. But Quen bones were built for a world that asked nothing of them, and the ice had asked. They could not dig a grave in the Combs. They could not carry him to the moraine. The sledges held the living and the means of keeping them so, and every kilo was budgeted, And this too was arithmetic. And everyone on the rope knew it, and nobody made the humans say it aloud. They lowered Rel back into the blue instead, wrapped in his bivouac sack, to the ledge that had caught him, and Ilian, as the only officer of the Atlas present, by a logic nobody questioned and nobody could have explained, read the manifest entry aloud. Over the whole, name, species, certification, home port. The wind took the words apart as fast as he produced them. Nadia stood at the edge with her hood back, which cost her, and what she said was not a eulogy. He walked the worst field on this planet for 3 hours and 40 minutes without one mistake, she said. The mistake was the planets. We take him home in the spring. She said it the way she said everything, level, certain, itemized, and Ilian understood, with a jolt that finally had nothing to do with the cold, that she meant it literally, that somewhere in that small frost-burned head, on a march measured in single days of food, a recovery expedition 6 months out had already been provisionally scheduled. The horror he had been carrying since the burial terrace shifted in his chest and became, without his permission, something with awe in it. The Atlas does not leave anyone on a closed world, he thought, in the formal hand. Strike that. The Atlas leaves everyone. It closes the file. These people do not close files. They came down off the moraine in failing light, 14 on the rope where 15 had been, and Station S6 rose out of the blowing ground drift like a grave marker for a giant, and behind them the combs lay white and smooth and patient, keeping what it kept. The storm caught them at S6 and sat on them for 2 days. It was not the long white. Bren was emphatic about that. In the gravel whisper that was all altitude had left him. Outrider, he said, listening to the roof. The big one sends scouts. This is weather. The long white is climate. You'll know the difference when you owe it money. But it was enough. A katabatic surge, marrying a storm cell, the anemometer Eli had rigged in the entrance trench tearing loose at a reading of 140, and the world outside the hatch becoming a solid substance, a white concrete poured over the planet, in which a person who walked 10 steps would not find the building again. Inside 14 souls and a stove, and arithmetic. Ilian had expected the confinement to be the easy part. He was wrong in a way that taught him something else about the humans, because the danger of the 2 days at S6 was not the wind, it was the room. It was 3 species worth of grief and fear with nowhere to put itself, in 11 meters of stone, in air going stale with breath and stove smoke, with the food tally written on the wall in Ostrom's commercial hand, where everyone could see it and everyone could do the division. The humans fought the room the way they fought everything else, with structure. Within an hour of the hatch ceiling, Nadia had posted a watch rota that gave every able body aboard a job with a name: stove watch, flue watch, melt watch, drift watch on the entrance trench, gear repair bench, even a school shift, which was Pim and a slate, and whichever adult was next on the list. Because Nadia said flatly, in the voice that ended discussions, a child does sums or a child does dread. There's no third thing at her age. And Ilian, assigned a school shift on the first afternoon, taught a Quen child the basic projection mathematics of the Meridian Atlas, while a hurricane tried to unscrew the roof, and noticed, somewhere in the second hour, that his own dread had gone quiet for the duration, and understood that the rota had been treating 14 patients, not one. It was on the second night of the storm, on stove watch, that he finally read the Earth entry. He had been avoiding it. He could admit that to himself now, with the company asleep around him and the wind making its long inhuman vowl over the flue. 9 days ago, at the wreck, he had opened his Atlas tablet to the entry for Vale, and beside it, in the index, alphabetically innocent, had sat the entry for Earth, and some clerk's instinct had said not yet. The way one does not look up the medical meaning of a symptom one is currently having. He looked it up now by stovelight while the planet roared. The entry was old. That was the first thing. It predated his own apprenticeship, predated the current format, and carried the marginal stamps of 4 successive review boards. And the stamps told their own story because each board had been convened, he saw, for the same purpose, not to update the entry, to dispute it. Atmospheric Volatility Index. The number was in the closure band, stamped beside it, verified, resurveyed, verified, seismic and volcanic activity, closure band, verified. Biosphere aggression rating, and here Ilian's stylus hand actually twitched, an annotator's reflex against an entry that had to be a transcription error, because the figure was not in the closure band. It was above it. The scale had been extended to accommodate it. The original surveyor's marginal note survived, in the stiff syntax of formal protest. The committee is reminded that this assessment excludes the dominant species evaluated separately. The committee is further reminded that the dominant species evolved here, in competition with everything this figure describes, and prevailed, and the committee is invited to sit with that for a moment before ratifying the classification. And then at the bottom, the line that 3 review boards had tried and failed to have struck from the record: status. permanently inhabited. Native sapient population. Thriving. Classification. See appendix. There was no closure glyph on the entry. There was no closure glyph because Ilian paged into the appendix with fingers that were not entirely steady. Closure was a quarantine of empty places, a lock on doors no one was behind, and Earth's door had 9 billion people behind it, and the Atlas had been forced, 2 centuries ago, to invent an entirely new annotation category for one world. He had heard the category named once in his first year by an old instructor who had used it as an example of taxonomic failure, of the day the measuring system met something it could not file. The annotation read, in full, environment, incompatible with sapient survival across all registered physiologies. Exception, see resident species. Resident species, see environment. Ilian sat with the tablet on his knees for a long time. Across the room in the bunk shadows, Nadia Rook slept the shallow ration sleep of the watch Rhoda, 24 years old, frost-burned, down 4 kilos she could not spare. The strongest single asset on a world that had killed a professional surveyor 3 days ago. And Ilian looked at her and at the entry and back, and the 2 pieces of information refused to stay separate any longer. The humans were not surviving Vale because they were brave. Bravery was a wager, and wagers could be lost. They were surviving Vale because Vale was, by the Atlas's own arithmetic, a mild instance of the place they already lived. The cold here was clean and predictable. The cold at home came with floods behind it and fire seasons and storm surges with names, and a biosphere rated literally off the chart in a list of routine human activities. Ilian paged, disbelieving, through the appendix's ethnographic notes that included swimming in tide zones, residing on fault lines, farming the slopes of active volcanoes because the soil is better, and a seasonal practice in the northern latitudes described by the original surveyor with audible despair as recreational reenactment of survival emergencies conducted by choice, with the participants paying for the privilege. He thought of Nadia on the burial terrace, unclipping from the rope with a child sliding toward the drop. He had filed it that day under impossible courage. He re-lettered the file now, by stovelight, with the wind screaming, and what he wrote in the margin of his own mind was worse and better at once. To her, that was Tuesday. Horror he had written on the first night of the march. He found the entry in himself and struck it through and wrote, in the careful hand of a clerk, making the most important correction of his apprenticeship, awe. Captain Aldous Bren died on the morning the storm broke, in the hour the humans called false dawn, with the wind dying outside, as if the 2 events had negotiated. There was no drama in it, which was its own kind of terrible. The crash had broken something inside him that Eli's crash couch surgery could splint but not mend, and 11 days of altitude had been collecting interest on the debt. And every person in S6 had watched the collection without being able to interrupt it. He did not slip away in sleep either. He did it like a navigator. He called his last fixes. He called Eli first. And what passed between them was short and professional, and ended with Eli writing something on the medical slate and Bren initialing it with 1 finger, account squared, treatment refused, witnessed filed. He called Ostrom, and the purser knelt his slab bulk beside the bunk with the ledger out, and Bren dictated, in fragments, the formal transfer of command authority of the vessel Corvell, such as she is wherever her parts lie, to Enrook, Loadmaster, and Ostrom, who 11 days ago had stood in the wreck and demanded the company hear plainly what madness the humans proposed, recorded the succession without 1 syllable of objection, and signed it, and pressed his purser's seal into the slate, and then did a thing no one present had ever seen a Drosk do for an alien. He lowered his head plates flat, the gesture of accounts in surplus, the gesture reserved for creditors one cannot repay. He called Ilian, and Ilian came and knelt where Ostrom had knelt, certain there had been an error. He was the youngest aboard, the least useful kilo on the rope, a clerk. But Bren's eyes found him with perfect clarity, and the gravel voice, down now to a whisper with gaps in it, said, Atlas man. The charts, survey grade the old line. Magnetic poles walked since then. Declination table in my bag, my own corrections. 40 years. Take them. The map lies a little more every year, boy. Your job, a gap, a breath, a weight, your job is to lie less. And last he called Nadia, and the company pretended with great care not to listen, and failed, because S6 was 11 meters long, and the man was a captain. He did not give her a speech. Ilian, who was learning to read humans the way he had once learned to read survey hands, understood that the speech had already happened, that it had been happening for 11 days, in the route notes and the drift corrections and the 1 in 3 avalanche odds. In every fix the broken old man had called from the sledge, while the young loadmaster led the line. The speech was concluded business. What he gave her instead, with his remaining strength, was a complaint. Took my legs, he murmured. Took my ship. Now the wind's quit, and I'm missing the best traveling day of the week. His hand found her sleeve. Don't waste it on me, Rook. Walk the day. Hear me? Walk the day. We'll walk it, Nadia said, level, itemized, her hand over his every meter of it, Cap. Course you will. His eyes had gone to the roof, to something past it. Closure 10. Place isn't so bad. Seen worse Februaries in Resolute, and that was the last fix Captain Aldous Bren ever called, a joke about the weather, and Ilian watched the humans receive it like a benediction. And he wrote it down later word for word because the Atlas had no category for a species that died like that, casually, mid-sentence, as if death were one more shelter on a long line and they knew the way to it already and were not impressed. They buried him an hour out from S6 on the broken day he had ordered them to walk, in the lee of the Marine's last boulder, a real grave this time, cut into wind slab with the ice saw, the company in a silent half-circle while the two remaining humans worked. No funeral had ever been shorter. Nadia set the saw down, set a flat splinter of stone at the head of the cut, and stood over it for the space of 4 breaths, visible breaths. 4 small clouds the wind took. Navigator's grave, she said. Highest fix on the line, he'd call that fitting. A 5th breath, march order. Tova on probe. We walked the day, and the day gave them the only mercy it had, which was distance, 11 kilometers in 7 hours, S5 by dark, and then 2 hours into the stage it presented its bill, because on this world even mercy was itemized. The sound came from behind them, a crack like the sky's own spar going, rolling down off the high plateau, followed by a long subterranean thunder that Ilian felt through his boot soles before his ears finished with it. The whole line stopped and turned. Far back, beyond the combs, beyond 2 days of walked white, the slope above the wreck site of the Corvelle was moving. Even at that distance, the scale was visible. A whole flank of the mountain shrugging, a brown-white wave front 2 kilometers wide. The slab release Bren had set at 1 in 3, arriving with his grave still fresh. The cloud it threw went up like a silent explosion and hung there, and the thunder arrived and kept arriving. And 14 people stood on the rope and watched the only path back to the only other shelter they knew be erased with a thoroughness no engineer could have matched. The slide had not reached the wreck. Nadia, glassing the distance with Bren's monocular, called it in a voice pitched for the whole line. The hull's clear, the slot held, they're alive, say it with me, they're alive. But the route to the wreck had ceased to exist. The slope had unloaded across 4 kilometers of the only viable line, and what it left was a chaos of compressed debris blocks the size of cargo. Containers, refrozen already, impassable to a rope team with sledges in any number of days that mattered. The company stood in silence and absorbed the new arithmetic. Behind them, the 4 who could not walk alive, with heaters and fuel and the larger share of nothing, sealed now behind a closed door of geology. Ahead 67 kilometers, 2 more stations. A dead relay, a folded mast. There was no longer a version of turning back. There had never really been a version of turning back, but the planet had now put it in writing. It was Ostrom who finally said it, and what he said told Ilian exactly how far the purser's ledgers had traveled in 11 days. Then the account is simplified, the Drosk rumbled, settling his sledge harness across his slab shoulders with a heave. 1 column, forward. Load master, I believe the captain ordered us to walk the day. Nadia looked at him for a moment, and Ilian saw it, the small exchange, the thing the two of them had built out of opposition without either of them ever conceding a word. And she nodded once, the way she nodded at a verified knot, and turned and walked. That night at S5, which stood intact, stocked its stove sound, its roof whole, 11 kilometers closer to the mast, Ilian took out his tablet to log the stage and found that his hands had stopped trembling at the day's end accounting. 2 graves and an avalanche, and his hands were steady. He examined this fact with a clerk's honesty. It was not numbness. It was not courage either, not exactly. It was something he had caught off the humans like a microbe. Some agreement their whole species seemed to have signed and never mentioned, and the closest his formal hand could come to its wording was, the situation is permitted to be unbearable. The work is not permitted to stop. He logged the stage. He logged Bren's grave with coordinates fixed off the corrected declination table so the spring expedition could find it. He had stopped doubting there would be a spring expedition. That, too, he noted in the margin, was new. The stage from S5 to S4 had a gate in the middle of it, and the gate was called the Bellows. Ilian had read the name in the survey logs at the wreck and assumed again poetry. It was not poetry. Where the plateau began its long step down toward the southern rim, 2 shoulders of black rock, the only bare rock they had seen in 80 kilometers, scoured naked by what lived between them, pinched the ice into a corridor half a kilometer wide and 4 long. And through that corridor the entire nighttime exhalation of the ice cap poured like a fluid down a funnel. The Katabatic River that was a hardship on the open plateau became in the Bellows a fact of ballistics. The survey logs recorded gusts in the corridor at numbers that Ilian had charted as an apprentice without once imagining them applied to his own body. It breathes on a cycle, Nadia said. They were holed up at S5 an extra half-day to wait for it, and she had the company around the stove, drawing the corridor on the floor flags in charcoal. Captain Bren pulled the cycle out of the old anemometer logs. The cap inhales in the late morning, pressure equalizes. The river slacks to almost nothing for 4, maybe 5 hours. That's the window. We enter at the slack, we move fast, we do not stop in the gate for anything. If the wind comes early, you drop. You clip to the fixed line if we've set one, and you make yourself a stone. Everyone says it back. The company said it back. 14 voices in 5 accents. Make yourself a stone. They entered the bellows at the slack, in a silence so total it had texture. Without the wind, the corridor was almost beautiful. Blue ice walls scalloped into flutes and shells by 10,000 years of the river, black rock above a ribbon of paling sky. The fast pace cost what fast cost at altitude. Ilian's lungs burned thin and high, every breath a spoon scraping an empty pot, and the line's breathing was the loudest sound on the planet. 14 ragged engines and the squeal of sledge runners on cold, squeaking snow. They were 3 kilometers through, 3/4 of the way, when Ushel's gill folds failed. It happened without a sound, which was the Hadal way. His people did not vocalize distress. They simply stopped being able to do things. He went down between one sledge step and the next, a creature the size of a cargo door folding like wet paper, and the humidity mask Eli had built him tore loose at the tube, and what the dry air had left of his gill folds began, with terrible efficiency, to finish. The next 11 minutes were, Ilian would write in the Atlas margin much later, the 11 minutes in which he understood the human species better than in the rest of the march. Combined, not because the humans were heroic, but because they were not. There was no drama at all. There was a sequence executed at speed, in a corridor where the sky could fall on them at any minute. Eli's shears already out, cutting away the failed mask before Ushel finished falling. Nadia stripping her own melt flask, the warm water that was her next 4 hours of margin, and Eli's and Tova's, building a wet compress over the gill folds with hands that did not hurry and did not stop. The spare liner, the spare tube, the child's drinking bladder requisitioned with a single extended hand and surrendered without a word, becoming, in 90 seconds of mitten field surgery, a second mask, cruder and better. Ostrom and Morrow repacking the lead sledge to take 12 stone of Hadal without dropping a single line of cargo, because the cargo was also lives. The line moving again. Total halt, 11 minutes, in the bellows, with the slack tide of the wind already somewhere up the corridor, beginning to turn. The river came back when they were 400 meters from the gate's southern mouth. It announced itself the way the survey logs said it would, with a sound like a far-off freight tunnel, and the company did not need the order. They went down as one organism, clipped axes in, sledges braked and bridled, 14 stones and 2 loaded sleds on a thread of fixed line. And the first gust walked over them like something with mass, like surf. And Ilian lay with his face in the snow doing the only job that remained to anyone, which was holding. They held through 4 gusts. Between the 4th and what would have been the 5th, in the slackening, Nadia's voice came down the line. Not loud, the wind made loud meaningless. Pitched, in the strange carrying way the humans had, to arrive, up, 400 meters, walk it. They walked it. The wind leaned on them the whole way, a hand against 14 chests, and they leaned back into it at the human-taut angle and put boots down one at a time, and at some point Ilian became aware that he was no longer thinking of the wind as a monster, or even as a weapon, but as a slope, a thing with a gradient you could read and a load you could carry, a tax, an itemized tax, and that this reframing was not his own, that he had caught it down the rope like body heat, that the humans radiated it the way a stove radiates warmth, the absolute, contagious, load-bearing assumption that the universe was survivable until proven otherwise, and that the proof had to be shown line by line, and that no line had yet been shown. They came out of the bellows southern gate into evening light and falling pressure, and Ushel was breathing wet and slow and alive on the sledge, and S4 was 4 kilometers ahead on the survey bearing. And that was when the bearing arrived, and the shelter did not. S4 had burned. Decades ago, by the look of what the snow had not buried, a fuel store fire, Nadia judged, reading the slumped char of the composite roof the way other people read text. The walls stood to hip height. The stove was a rusted throat full of ice. The ration cache was a black smear. Of the 4 hardened shelters between the wreck and the relay, the third one was a ruin, and the temperature was already dropping through the bottom of the day, and the next intact roof was 11 kilometers and a full stage away, across ground none of them had the light or the legs to walk. Ilian watched the company receive it. He had learned to read the postures by now, the Quen's long necks dipping, the Ceph going very still, Ostrom's plate settling like a wall finding its footing. 14 people, one of them half drowned in dry air, at 5,000 meters, with the night wind coming, and no building. Nadia took the monocular off the ruin, looked at the snow around it. The deep, wind-packed drift banked against the dead walls, and Ilian saw, with disbelief he would be ashamed of by morning, that the human was almost pleased. "Good drift," she said. "Best digging snow on the line so far. Eli, probe me this bank." And then to 14 stares and 5 physiologies, with the first true warmth the march had heard from her, the closest thing to a smile the cold had left her face. "We're not sleeping in the ruin. We're sleeping in the snow. The snow is the building. People. It always was. Shovels." They thought she had finally broken. Ilian could feel the thought move down the line in 5 languages. The snow was the enemy's own body, the substance of the storm, the stuff that had buried the route home and lidded the crevasses of the combs, and the human proposed to sleep inside it, and the human was already digging, and the human was humming while she dug. She cut the entrance low and the sleeping platform high, and lectured while she worked, between economical breaths, like an instructor running a familiar practical. Cold sinks, heat rises. You dig the door downhill of the bed, and the cold falls out the door all night like water down a drain. You vent the roof with a probe hole the width of 2 fingers. You keep the roof a forearm thick, and it will hold a standing drosk, and the wind can do whatever it likes. The wind is now structural. Snow is air wearing a shell. It insulates better than the survey-grade panel in that burned roof ever did. By the time the cave was 4 body lengths deep, the digging crews had stopped being humored and started being students. By full dark, there were 3 caves bored into the bank in a triangle, linked by crawl tunnels floored with sledge tarps and bivouac sacks, and the temperature inside the largest one, with 8 bodies and 1 stove flame the size of a thumb, had climbed to a figure that made Ilian unzip his outer layer for the first time in 13 days. He lay that night in a building made of the blizzard's own ammunition, listening to the Katabatic River howl across a roof of packed weather, 2 degrees above freezing, warmer than he had been since the crash, and composed the amendment slowly, with the care it deserved, because he knew by now that these margins were going to be read. Amendment proposed. Meridian Atlas, general notes on the human species. Existing entry describes this species as adapted to hostile environments. The entry is in error. Adaptation is submission, a species shaped to fit a niche. As the Quen fit their gentle plains, and my own people fit our warm shallows. Humans do not fit their world, they negotiate with it. They take its weapons into inventory and issue them back out as tools. Snow is a wall. Wind is a slope. Fear is an instrument. Night is a schedule. The Atlas classifies environments by what they do to a sapient body, and the classification is sound for every registered species but one. Because for one species, the environment is not a verdict. It is a warehouse. Pim's voice came out of the dark beside him, very small. In the careful trade pigeon the child had been assembling all March like a nest. Ilian, the snow is warm. Yes, at least the snow was trying to kill us before, yes. A long silence, in which a 6-year-old of a species from a world without winter audited the universe. It can do both, Pim decided at last, with the gravity of a review board, and went to sleep against his shoulder. And Ilian lay awake a while longer, listening to a human on watch crawl tunnel quietly checking the vent hole on the hour, and thought that the child had just drafted a better entry for this entire species than he had managed in 13 days of margins. It can do both. Strike nothing. File as written. The mutiny, such as it was, came at dawn, and it came politely over biscuits, which made it harder to fight than any storm. Marosef raised it, his bandaged eyes turned toward the sound of Nadia's voice, and one of the unnamed Quen porters stood with him, and Ilian could hear in both voices that this was not cowardice. It was the snow cave's fault. The company had slept warm. Warmth after 13 days was an argument with a gravity of its own. "We can dig," Morrow said. "You taught us that last night, Loadmaster. We can dig, and the drift here is good. You said so yourself, and there is meltwater, and we have rations yet. The bellows is behind us. The combs are behind us. Ahead of us is 41 kilometers of ground even you have never seen, and a climb in worse air into the front edge of the worst season this planet owns. I am asking the question someone must ask. Why not stop? Dig deep, hold our warmth, spend the long white here, and walk out in the spring?" It was, Ilian thought, a good question. That was the dangerous thing about it. 60 hours ago it would have been Ostrom's question. Nadia did not answer it at once. She finished pouring the melt round, the morning water, measured, passed hand to hand in the steaming half-light of the cave mouth, and when she spoke it was without heat, without even urgency, in the tone of someone walking a colleague through a load manifest that would not balance. "Run the food with me," she said, out loud. Ostrom. The purser had the figures before she finished his name. 11 days at current ration, 17 at deep cut, 22 at a ration I will not, as ranking supply officer, sign. The long white, Nadia said, is 6 months. Morrow I want it to work. You don't know how much. The caves are good, you all built well, and that's a real thing. That's a skill you'll have for the rest of your lives. But a snow cave is a night. It is not a life. There's no fuel here past the sledge reserve, no cash, no game, no lichen. Nothing this planet has ever grown that we can put in a pot. The math doesn't whisper, it shouts. Anyone who winters here starves by midwinter, warm. She let that stand exactly long enough, and not a heartbeat longer. And there's a second column, the 4 at the wreck. Their fuel runs out in 19 days. The avalanche shut their door, nobody walks out to them. Nothing flies in this weather without a beacon to home on. The only thing in this hemisphere that can save them is a live signal on that mast before the long white seals the sky. We are not walking to the relay to save ourselves, not anymore. We're the only rescue party the Corvell has, silence in the cave mouth. The wind had dropped with the dawn, and Ilian could hear individual breaths. You knew all this, Morrow said at last, when you stood in the wreck and proposed the march. You had already counted the 4 who couldn't come. Yes, and you didn't say it. I said the radio first and then you, Nadia said. I meant the order of operations. A pause and then, with the first thing Ilian had ever heard under her voice that might have been weight, might have been the cost of the ledger she carried and never read aloud. I count them every night, Morrow. Same as I count you. The list doesn't get shorter because we're tired. Morrow Seth stood in the blue dawn with his burned eyes and his dead brother's share of the hauling line in his hand. His brother was not dead. Ilian corrected himself, his brother at the wreck, which was now the same wager, and the company watched him weigh a warm hole in the snow against 41 kilometers of unsurveyed cold, and choose, because the choosing mattered more for being out loud. Then I'd say we're burning daylight, Morrow said, in a fair imitation of the dead captain's gravel, and the line laughed, actually laughed. 14 ragged engines at 5,000 meters and broke camp. Amendment Ilian filed, watching them pack. Human leadership, sub-entry. They do not suppress dissent. They arm it with arithmetic and let it convict itself. Note for the Atlas's diplomatic annex. This is also how they will negotiate treaties. Prepare accordingly. The drain announced itself 2 hours into the stage as a sound underfoot, a hollow, glassy, running note beneath the squeak of the snow, like a flooded corridor heard through a wall. The survey map called the feature a relic meltwater channel system and had, 40 years ago, marked it dry. Bren's marginalia and the old man's spiking hand had disagreed. Geothermal seep south of the bellows. Channels live in all seasons. Crossing requires survey. The planet, it turned out, had a circulatory system. Deep under the cap, the world's residual heat bled into the ice and carved rivers under the surface. And where the plateau stepped down toward the rim, those rivers ran shallow, roofed by a lid of refrozen crust anywhere from 2 meters thick to the thickness of a window pane. Indistinguishable from above, with black water moving underneath at a temperature that was, by an irony Ilian had no spare blood to appreciate, just barely too warm to freeze. They probed it like the combs. They roped it like the combs. Tova found a crossing where the channel braided wide and shallow, where the lid rang thick under the pole on a line of cleared, certified steps, and 11 of the 14 were across, and the sledges were across. And Ilian was 3 steps from the far bank when the planet, which had been watching his careful boots, he would swear in the margins forever, which had been waiting for the clerk, opened the floor under him without a sound. There was no crack, no warning shout, no slow-motion grace. The world was white, and then the world was black and roaring and had no up in it, and the cold was not cold. That was the first lie it told. It was a full-body blow, an immense crushing handshake, every nerve in his skin firing at once, and then almost instantly beginning to go quiet. And the quiet was the second lie, and his lungs wanted to gasp, and there was no air to gasp. Only the black moving water and the pale lid of the world sliding past above him, lit from beyond like a frosted window, carrying him downstream away from the hole he had made. Something seized his harness. Did not see the rope work that put Nadia Rook into the water. He learned it afterward, in pieces, the way he had learned the crevasse. How the line had gone taut to the bank anchors before he was fully under. How she had tracked his shape under the lid at a dead sprint along the certified steps, reading the shadow of him through the frosted window of the crust. How she had picked the downstream thin spot with one axe blow test. Told Eli plainly, 8 meters he comes to me, punched through and gone down into the black to be the thing he hit. What he knew at the time was only this. A hand on his harness in a world that had no hands in it. A violence of direction where there had been none. His face breaking into screaming air, the lip of the broken crust gnawing his arms, and a voice, level, unhurried, 2 inches from his ear, in the water with him, in the black freezing dark of a proscribed world, the most casual sound he had ever heard, saying, "Got you. Kick on 3. The bank then. Hands, many hands, Drosk and Seth and Quen hands. Being skinned out of his frozen clothes with shears in the open wind at 30 below, he tried to protest and produced no sound the wind respected, and packed, naked as a hatchling, into a bivouac sack already lined with 2 chemical heat cells and 1 strip to the liner Hadal, because Ushel ran warm and wet and had insisted, and a second body crawling in. Eli, counting Ilian's pulse against his own wrist chronometer, narrating everything in the flat clinical murmur the humans used at the bottoms of emergencies. Cores intact, shivering strong, that's good. Shivering means the furnace works. You'll feel like dying for an hour. That's the recommended dose. Vesca blood thickens but his pressure's holding. Write that down, someone. The Atlas Physiology's annex is wrong about cold response in Vesca, and I am not above publishing from a sleeping bag. And Nadia, who had been in the same water, was outside the sack in dry spares from the sledge with her hair freezing into spikes, running the line, because the crossing was not finished and the daylight was not negotiable, and when Elian surfaced from the gray roar in his ears long enough to find her shape against the sky, she was issuing the order that he would think about for the rest of his life, in the same voice she used for knots. Repack to cross. We've got 90 minutes of light and a sick man to keep moving. He stays horizontal, he stays packed, he rides the lead sledge. Pim, sit on him. You're the warmest thing your size on this planet. It was not until full dark, in the bivouac caves dug into the far bank's drift, his blood moving again, his body one continuous bruise, a Quen child asleep on his chest like a paperweight, that Ilian remembered the tablet. It had been in his pack. His pack had been on his back. The drain had taken both, and with them every chart of Vale in the company's possession. The survey cartography, the station bearings, the relay schematics, Bren's declination table. No, the declination table was a sheaf of physical paper in a wax sleeve, and it was in Eli's medical chest, because Ilian had been copying corrections from it at S5, and the humans put things back where things lived. But the maps were gone. The route ahead, the unsurveyed 41 kilometers, the gallery traverse, the final descent to Cairn, the relay post's own layout, the mast's fold geometry that he had studied lying on his bunk at the wreck like a student before an examination, was in his head. All of it. He tested it lying there with the panic held at arm's length in the human way, item by item. The gallery's 7 survey bearings recited. The traverse's 2 bivouac benches, their altitudes recited. The relay post plan, 3 buildings and a mast foundation, drawn from memory against the dark of his eyelids in the formal projection of the Atlas, line by remembered line. 3 years of apprenticeship under instructors who had made him copy charts by hand until his fingers cramped, who had failed him twice on the Vale practicum, until he could reproduce the southern rim quadrangle from memory. Every one of those wasted, hated, obsolete hours stood up now in the dark of a snow cave at the bottom of the worst sky in the Atlas and reported for duty. He began to laugh. It hurt extravagantly, and he did it anyway, a thin Vesca wheeze, and Pim stirred on his chest and Eli's voice came dry out of the dark. Either recovery or hypothermic euphoria, and for the record, I'm logging it as recovery. And Ilian lay in the wreckage of his own profession and understood that the Atlas had not been wrong to train him as it had. The Atlas had merely never imagined the circumstances under which the training would be load-bearing. I'm the map now, he said aloud to the cave, in trade, and from the crawl tunnel where she was checking the vent on the hour, he heard the loadmaster of the Corvelle answer, warm and level and entirely unsurprised. You always were Atlas, man, we just carried the spare. The gallery was the last hard ground on the line, and the survey had named it honestly for once. A shelf of wind-carved ice running 3 kilometers along the inside of the plateau's rim wall, a balcony above the world. On its left hand rose the final swell of the cap. On its right hand, beyond a sculpted lip of cornice, the plateau simply stopped, fell away 2 vertical kilometers to a sea of cloud that stretched to the curve of the planet, the cloud deck of the lower world, underlit in the morning to the color of brushed steel. Somewhere down through that deck, 3,800 meters below their boots, was air a body could almost trust. Between here and there stood the traverse, the descent gullies, and the small dark promise at the shelf's far end that Ilian's memory insisted. Bearing by recited bearing was relay post Cairn. The air on the gallery was the thinnest of the march. There was no drama left in that observation. There was only the arithmetic of steps. The humans taught the line the rest step on the first morning. Lock the back knee. Let the bone carry you for half a heartbeat so the muscle can shop for oxygen. Then the next step, a rhythm not of strength but of bookkeeping. And the company crawled along the balcony of the world at the pace of a funeral that had decided to be a supply convoy. Instead, Ilian navigated. There was no map left to consult, so the map walked second on the rope and called the bearings from memory, and the company followed a 19-year-old clerk's recitation along a shelf where an error of 2 degrees would put them either under the cap's last icefall or out through the cornice and into the sky. He had been terrified of exactly this for the first hour. Then Nadia had dropped back beside him, watched him check his third bearing against Bren's declination sheet with hands he was keeping deliberately, slow, and said conversationally, Out of everybody that boarded that ferry, the one I'd picked to carry the route in his head is the one whose teachers made him bleed for it. And walked forward again, and the terror had not vanished but had been, in the human way, reassigned. From judge to load, carry it, itemize it, make it pull, Ostrom hauled. That was the gallery's other arithmetic. The thin air that merely taxed the rest of them sat on the heavy whirled Drosk like a fine. His great plates rose and fell like a forge bellows. And he had, without consultation or announcement, redistributed cargo at the morning loading so that his own sledge carried double. The beacon core, the fuel reserve, the medical chest, the dense hearts of the expedition, on the grounds, entered formally in the ledger when Nadia caught it and made him say it aloud. That mass per available breath should pool where the breaths are largest. On the second rest halt, Ilian watched the purser sit slab still, eyes half shuttered, metering his own respiration like a man counting coins, and then watched him slide his own ration biscuit unbroken across the snow to Pym with one stone finger and the entry already composed. Transfer, internal. Growth requires capital. The recipient is growing. You've changed your books, purser, Ilian said quietly. I have corrected them, Ostrom said. An audit found the old accounts were measuring the wrong assets. His eye plates clicked toward the front of the rope, toward the small frost-burned figure-breaking trail along the rim of the sky. I recorded my objection at the wreck. I will record this also, so the record is honest. The objection was sound by every method I was taught, and every method I was taught would have killed us in that hull. Note it, Atlas Man. Sometimes the ledger is wrong about what counts. The cornice took its try at them an hour past noon. It went without warning, as cornices do. A 50-meter scallop of the gallery's outer lip, wind-built over decades, deciding in one crystalline instant that it had always been part of the sky rather than the shelf. And it took the certified trail with it, and it would have taken Tova, who was probing 4 meters ahead of the line, if the rope had been 1 meter longer or Eli's reflexes 1 heartbeat slower. The world dropped out from under her front half. The rope came taut on the anchors, and for one long obscene moment the Quen prober hung at the hinge of the planet, boots over 2 kilometers of silver cloud, while the broken lip roared away below her into a silence that took a very long time to finish. They hauled her back with the drilled smoothness of people who had paid their tuition in the combs. And she lay in the snow and shook, and the company stood clipped and silent on the suddenly narrower balcony, and it was Tova herself who ended the moment. Tova, who had wanted her daughter bundled safe on a sledge 16 days ago, who had walked point through every lying floor this planet owned, pushing herself up on her long arms, reclaiming the probe pole from where it had fallen, and saying in trade, in a voice that shook exactly once and then leveled like a gauge finding its line, new rule, the mountain does not get to keep the pole. Eli laughed first. Then the Ceph, then unwillingly, helplessly Ilian, the thin air making fools of all of them. And Nadia looked back down the rope at her company, laughing at death on the last kilometer of the worst traverse in the Atlas, and Ilian saw her allow herself 2 full seconds of something that was not a smile but was its administrative equivalent, and then inside line. Full intervals. Walk. Relay post cairn rose out of the blowing ground drift at the end of the gallery like the answer to a question 40 years. Stale. 3 low buildings in the survey style, drifted to their eaves, huddled on a bench of bare rock where the rim wind kept the footing swept. And above them, lashed down along its full folded length like a felled tree, like a sleeping thing, like the single most important object in Ilian's universe, the mast. 40 meters of lattice steel in 3 hinged sections, lying in its cradles exactly where the decommissioning crew had left it, its base still bolted to the foundation ring, its folding hinges packed with 4 decades of ice. The dish lay beside it under a burial mound of drift. The transmitter house stood open to the snow, its racks slagged into glass 40 years ago by men with thermal charges and a checklist, and in the doorway of that gutted room, with the last red daylight failing and the wind moaning in the dead lattice, Nadia Rook set down the beacon core, put her bare hand flat on the cold steel of the mast's first section, and addressed the expedition's objective for the first and only time. "Hello, throat," she said. "We brought you a voice." The inventory took until midnight by lamplight in wind that was changing its grammar. Ilian heard the change before he could name it, a new patience in the gusts, a lower register, as if the planet had stopped improvising, and Bren's voice supplied the name from memory. "You'll know the difference when you owe it money." The Long White's leading edge was 2 days early. The accounting, when Ostrom chalked it on the transmitter house wall, ran thus. In their favor, the mast intact in its cradles, the waveguide run sound, the dish recoverable by shovel, the foundation ring true, the beacon core dry, charged, and patient. 1 window of workable weather, perhaps a day and a half before the front's first full cell arrived. Against them, the mast's 3 hinge joints frozen into single fused knuckles of ice and corrosion. the erection winch, the machine that had folded the mast down, stripped of its motor by the decommissioning crew, leaving a bare drum and a geared crank, rations at 4 days at deep cut, fuel at 6, and 14 bodies, every one of them carrying the march in their joints and their blood counts, of which exactly 2 belonged to a species that considered any of this a reasonable way to spend a week. Eli read the wall, did the medic's private sum first, and said it plainly because the humans always said the cost plainly. Whatever we're doing, we do it on the next 2 days' bodies. The bodies after that won't be able. Then we'll use these, Nadia said. They thawed hinges all the next day. There was no elegance in it. Lamp fuel stoves bricked into windbreaks around each joint, meltwater hauled and boiled and poured, the ice chipped and the corrosion wire brushed by mittened hands in rotation. Grease from the sledge runners worked into 40-year-old bearings a gram at a time, while the wind rose in slow installments, and the southern sky stacked itself with cloud the color of a closing eye. By dusk, the first 2 hinges turned. The third, the top joint, the one that would swing the final 15 meters of lattice and the antenna head, itself upright, turned, groaned, and stopped, fused at some depth no stove could reach, and the light went, and the fronts outriding snow began to walk across the post in long hissing files, and they retreated into the gutted transmitter house, and sealed the door, and listened to the long white clear its throat. It was the worst night of the march, and nothing happened in it. That was what made it the worst. There was no crevasse to bridge, no channel to cross, no body to warm, only arithmetic chalked on a wall in commercial shorthand, and 14 people lying in the dark doing it over and over while the building shook. 1 frozen joint, 1 fading weather window, 4 days of food, and 81 kilometers of walked, buried, bought and paid for white between them and everyone they had promised. Sometime after midnight, Pim's voice, small and clear in the dark, asked the question the adults had been stepping around since dusk. If the mast doesn't stand up, do we dig a cave and wait? And Nadia's voice came back, unhurried, from her watchpost by the door, and Ilian lay in the dark and listened to a human teach a child the whole doctrine of her impossible species in 11 words, the same 11 he would one day have set into the printed atlas itself if the review boards had let him. The mast stands up, Pim. We just haven't finished asking yet. The dawn came with a gift, and the gift was a gap. Ilian heard it arrive, heard the wind's grammar break, the long sentences of the front collapsing into fragments, then into a hissing quiet, and Nadia was already at the door with the barometer in her fist, reading the sky the way Bren had read ice. The front was not one wall. It came, she said, as cells walking in files, and between the first file and the second the planet had left a seam. 6 hours, perhaps 8. After that, by every sign the old logs and her own weather-burned instincts could read, the door would shut for 6 months. So we raise it now, she said, and we raise it once. The engineering was human in the way Ilian had stopped being surprised by, which is to say it was improvised, ancient, and made almost entirely of leverage. The decommissioning crew had taken the winch motor but left the geared crank, the drum, and the anchor points, because no checklist written for an empty world bothers about cranks. Nadia and Eli built the rest before the light was full. Shear legs cut from the sledge rails and lashed into an A-frame to break the dead lift. The haul line led through the survey's own pulleys, doubled, then doubled again, each doubling, Eli explained to a watching, skeptical, slowly comprehending Seth, halving the force and doubling the patience, which is the entire history of our species in one sentence, until 40 meters of lattice steel could be argued upright by 14 exhausted bodies in one crank. They raised the mast in 90 minutes in rotations to a work chant with no words. The lower hinge took the load with a groan that ran through the rock itself. The lattice came off its cradles a centimeter at a time, and Ilian, hauling forth on the line with his thin blood roaring, watched the angle grow, 10 degrees, 20, the mast's shadow swinging across the post like the hand of an enormous instrument, and felt the thing he had no Vesca word for and had stopped, trying to translate, the specific human alchemy by which a doomed quantity of strength, divided through enough pulleys and shared across enough shoulders, becomes sufficient. At 60 degrees, the mast walked past its balance point and settled into the foundation ring's locking taper with a boom like a struck bell, and the company pinned it and stood gasping in the seam of the storm and looked up. 2/3 of a mast stood against the stacked gray sky. The top section, the final 15 meters, the antenna head, the whole point of 90 kilometers, lay folded back against the standing lattice, like a broken wing, fused at its hinge 25 meters above the rock. My joint, Nadia said, my climb. No one argued, because the alternative candidates did not exist, and the humans did not perform debates whose outcomes were already arithmetic. Ostrom was 4 times too heavy for the lattice ice. The Quinn had no grip strength at altitude. Ushel could not leave his humid mask. Eli's hands were the company's only surgery and would be needed whole, and Ilian, Ilian was the map and the splice, and his work was at the bottom of the mast in the transmitter house, where the waveguide's severed root waited for the beacon core. The strongest climber aboard was the loadmaster, and the loadmaster was already racking her harness. Pry bar, hammer, grease tin, and 2 steel flasks of boiling water packed in liner cloth like a pair of newborn things. "Wind's coming back at midday," she said, cinching the chest strap. "Ellie runs the ground. Atlas man, when the head swings up in seats, you'll see the feed flag drop at the junction. You make your splice live before I'm down. We don't spend this gap twice. Say it back." "The splices live before you're down," Ilian said, and his voice held, and that was its own entry in the margin. She climbed. Ilian watched from the transmitter house door, the schematics scrolling behind his eyes, while a 24-year-old human ascended a 40-year-old lattice into the seam of a 6-month storm. Not fast, never fast, 3 points on the steel at all times, breath metered in the rest step rhythm, transposed for vertical work, stopping at each cross brace to clip, test, breathe, climb. The first file of the front was past, but its rearguard gusts still came through the post in long raking files, and each time the lattice moaned, she simply stopped, locked on, put her hood against the steel, and made herself a stone 25 meters up the sky, and waited out what could not be argued with, and climbed again when it could. At the joint she went to work like a surgeon at a fused knee, boiling water from the first flask, poured slow along the hinge line, the hammer, in measured blows, each one placed and listened to. The pry bar walked around the knuckle a degree at a time, more water. Grease into the wakening seam, and the wind rising, audibly rising, the second file of the long white, visible now from the ground as a darkness, assembling itself across the whole southern sky, a tide with a schedule. Ostrom stood at the foot of the mast with the ledger forgotten in his hands, head plates back, watching. Pym did not watch. The child had taken station inside Nadia's discarded parka by the door, holding it the way harbor people hold a mooring line, as if the keeping of it were load-bearing. Perhaps it was. The joint gave at the second flask. Ilian heard it from the ground, a crack, then a shriek of steel, remembering its purpose, and the folded section shuddered, and the ground crew took up the gin line, and 15 meters of lattice and antenna head swung slowly up off the standing section, through the gusts, through 110 degrees of gray sky, while a human hung off the joint itself with one arm and guided the moving steel with the other, and seated with a clang the rock carried into everyone's boots into its taper. Ilian saw her drive the locking pins with 4 hammer blows. He saw the feed flag drop at the junction. He was already moving. The transmitter house, the gutted racks, the waveguide root rising out of the floor like the stump of an iron tree, and the beacon core in its cradle of sledge lashings open now, its service panel off, its leads laid out in the order he had rehearsed in 3 snow caves and a bivouac sack by a young man who had memorized the relay schematics on a bunk at the wreck, because his teachers had taught him that you copy the chart until the chart is in your hands. The splice was not delicate work by design. Survey hardware was built for mittens and bad days. It was only unforgiving. Feed to coupler. Coupler to root, ground strap, torqued, service loop, dressed, because Bren's ghost rasped, "Dress your loops, boy." Slack is a flag of surrender in some margin of his mind. Power bus from the core's own cells, bridged, status ring amber, self-test cycling. The building shaking now in the rising wind, the second file's first true gust striking the post like a shoulder, and somewhere above him 40 meters of steel, taking it and singing, holding, guide, and pinned, and asked. The ring went green. Ilian would try many times, in the years and the margins to come, to describe the sound a live emergency signature makes inside a dead room, and would fail, because it makes almost none. A click of relays, a low carrier hum down in the bones of the waveguide, the smallest possible voice. But the post-surviving line monitor, a 40-year-old analog dial the decommissioning crew had not bothered to slag, kicked once against its pin, and settled into a steady, breathing flicker. Transmit, 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 and that flicker said, somewhere above the stacked gray murder of this sky, through it, indifferent to it, a registered distress signature off a Closure 10 world was now arriving at every relay picket in 40 light years. Again and again and again, a mandatory response event, a fact in the law of 11 species, a shout that could not be unheard or filed away or argued with, the Corvell, calling. He walked out into the wind. Nadia was down on the rock on her feet, being checked over by Eli's hands while she watched the dial through the door. And the company stood around the mast's foot in the strengthening snow, looking up the singing steel at the antenna head where it held against the racing gray, and nobody cheered. Ilian understood by now. Cheering was for outcomes. This was a transmission. The outcome was a cutter in the sky, and until then there was watch rota and melt duty and 4 days of food. But Ostrom opened the ledger one-handed against the wind and wrote, and afterward Ilian got him to show the entry, and the entry said, "Teen balance restored." The mast stood up. They had not finished asking. The cruelty of the beacon, Ilian learned over the next 3 days, was that it only talked. The survey post's receiving gear had been slagged with everything else. The Corps shouted its registered signature into the closing sky on schedule, to the second, tirelessly, and could not hear whether anything shouted back. There was no acknowledgement channel, no answering light, no way to know if the first picket had caught the signal in the first hour, or whether some fault in 40-year-old waveguide was bleeding their voice into the ice. There was only the dial, breathing its transmit flicker, and above it the long white, arriving in earnest now, sealing the sky they were shouting through. The humans dealt with the unbearable interval the way they had dealt with everything. They gave it a structure and made it pull a sledge. Within a day, the post was a functioning station. Snow walls banked to the eaves for insulation, a melt rotation, a galley shelf, the watch wrote a chalk beside Ostrom's accounts, and a maintenance liturgy for the mast itself, because the mast was the only voice they had and the storm was working at its guys around the clock. Twice a day, in paired rotation, 2 figures went out on the fixed line into the white roar with a hammer and a torque bar to walk the anchor points, and Ilian noticed, everyone noticed, nobody said it, that the rotation list for the mast walk now included every able species on the post, that the Ceph went, and the Quinn went, and a Vesca clerk went, clipped and hooded, and counting his steps in the screaming dark beside whichever human had the shift, checking shackle pins by feel with the planet trying to take the mittens off his hands. The humans had stopped being the only ones who did the impossible things. That was the change. Somewhere on 90 kilometers of ice, the impossible things had become chores, and chores were for everyone. The food ran out on schedule, the evening of the second day at the post, the last divided biscuit, the last measured round of survey tea brewed from its third reuse of the same leaves, Ostrom recording the final entry of his ration ledger with a formality that bordered on ceremony, account closed, and nothing about the room's mood matching the words, because Eli followed the ceremony by producing, from the medical chest with a straight face, a sealed sleeve of glucose tablets. Desert, I'm a doctor, I'm allowed to hide things. They were the worst-fed, warmest, strangest 3 days of Ilian's life. The company told stories in the dark to spend the hours. That was a human watch custom too, and it had spread like the rest. And so it happened that a Drosk purser by Stovelight, at the bottom of a 6-month storm, recited the commercial epic of his grandmother's first cargo run, and Tova sang the Quinn planting rounds with Pim carrying the child's verse. And Ushal, voice still wet and slow, described oceans none of them would ever swim, and Nadia Rook, pressed by a unanimous room on the third night, told them about Earth. She did not tell them about the biosphere ratings or the storm names. She told them about a lake behind her grandfather's cabin that killed somebody every few years, and where every child in the settlement nonetheless learned to swim. About the bell on the school wall rung for whiteout drills. About her mother checking the weather every morning of her life, the way other people checked their messages, eyes to the sky, reading it. About the road out of the valley posted closed 8 weeks of winter, and what the kitchen shelves looked like in autumn because of it. Ordinary things, maintenance things. The aliens listened the way one listens to mythology, and Ilian listened with the atlas entry open behind his eyes, resident species. See environment, and understood that he was hearing it translated at last into its native tongue, which was not awe at all. It was housekeeping. The most dangerous world in the registered galaxy was held, day upon day, by small procedures done on time by everyone forever, and the species that grew up that way had walked off the bottom of this one, carrying everybody else's luggage. The storm tested them once more before it relented, because nothing on Vale was given, only sold. It happened on the third night, on the mast walk, and Ilian was on the rotation when it happened. He and Eli were halfway around the anchor circuit, hooded and clipped, working by feel in a blackness that ate their lamps whole, when the torque bar in Ilian's mittens told him something his eyes could not. The northeast guy anchor's shackle pin had backed off a quarter turn, and the guy itself, the windward guy, the one carrying the storm's whole argument, was strumming at a frequency that he had learned 90 kilometers ago to translate wrong, singing wrong. He did not shout for the human. That was the part he would think about afterward. The entry that proved the march had rewritten him somewhere below the level of decision. He put his hood against the steel the way she would have, read the vibration with his teeth nearly on the cable, mapped the failure with his hands, pin walking, keeper cracked, 3 threads from letting 40 meters of their only voice whip loose into the dark. And then he banged his lamp twice against the anchor plate, the signal for second pair of hands, not the signal for fear, and went to work with the bar while he waited. Eli arrived in 40 seconds with the spares pouch. The repair took 11 minutes in wind that hit them like surf, the two of them lying across the anchor plate in turns, One body as a windbreak for the other's hands. New pin, new keeper, safety wire run twice through and twisted off by a six-fingered grip that had stopped feeling like a clerk's. Neither of them said one word that was not load-bearing. When it was done, they checked the remaining anchors anyway. All of them in order, because the rotation list said the circuit, and the circuit was the circuit. Inside, in the stove light, Eli reported it to the watch in 9 words. Northeast pin walked, resecured, wired, recommend morning recheck, and sat down to his tea. But Ilian saw him glance across the room at Nadia, and saw the look that went between the two humans over the heads of the company, and understood it as clearly as if it had been chalked on the wall with the accounts. Not relief, inventory. The windward guy had started to fail in the dark, 3 days from rescue or from nothing, and the creature who had caught it, read it, signaled it correctly, and fixed it lying down in a Closure 10 storm had been a 19-year-old Vesca map clerk who, 18 days ago, could not walk across a burial terrace without being blown off the planet. Nobody put it in words. The atlas would have needed a new annotation category anyway. But when the rotation list went up the next morning, the massed walk pairings had quietly stopped distinguishing, in any column that mattered, between the species that had been born to this and the species that had learned it, and Ilian read the list and took his tea and filed the change where he was keeping everything now, in the margins, under the heading that had stopped being a question somewhere out on the white. What the residents share. The sound came at mid-morning on the 4th day, down through the roar of the storm, and it was wrong for the storm. A tone underneath the wind, harmonic, sustained, growing, engines throttled hard against weather, descending, nobody moved for 1 full second. Then the post moved as one creature. The cutter came down through a closing cell gap with its running lights burning holes in the white murk, a cordon rescue hull built like a fist, and it did not so much land on the bench as pin itself to it, grapnels first, engines still fighting. Ilian stood on the fixed line in the blast, and the lights with the company around him, and watched the ramp come down and watched figures in heavy. Rescue rigs pound out into the wind of a Closure 10 world, instruments up, voices on loudhailers in formal trade, and he heard the first word civilization had to say to the company of the Curvelle after 18 days. Identify. How many alive? And Ostrom, purser of the Curvelle, keeper of its manifest, stepped forward into the lights with his ledger held against his chest like a writ, and gave the count his whole body had been built to give. Plate voice pitched to carry through storm and engines both. 13 at this post. 4 at the wreck site, north-northwest, 81 kilometers, coordinates to follow, alive as of the slide, fueled until the 35th day. 2 dead on the route, marked and fixed for recovery. 5 dead at the crash, buried. We are the Corvelle. We walked here. The rescue commander's faceplate turned slowly, from the slab-armored Drosk to the snow-walled post, to the chalked accounts visible through the door, to the mixed company standing easy in a wind that was flattening her own crew's first-out team against their lines, and to the mast, 40 meters of survey lattice standing live and singing in the front edge of the long white, beaconing on a world that the Atlas certified no sapient could cross. She was Tessic, Ilian would learn later, Cordon Rescue, 19 years of service. The officer who had answered 4 previous closure beacons and found all 4 times transmitters and bodies. You walked here, she repeated, on the open channel very carefully, like a woman handling an instrument reading she did not accept. From where? Nadia Rook stepped into the light beside Ostrom, small, frost-scared, down 9 kilos, carrying a Quinn child on her hip because Pym had refused all other transport across the ramp wind, and answered the question the way she answered everything, plainly as a matter of record. From the far side of the combs, the bellows, and the gallery. Commander, the 4 at the wreck are the priority. The route's gone, you'll be homing on hull metal and dead ground, and I can talk your pilot through the slot's wind behavior on the way. We can debrief in the air. There was a silence on the channel that even the storm respected. In the air, Commander Tessic agreed, and Ilian, clipped to the fixed line of a dead relay post on the worst world the Atlas had ever closed, watching a human already walking up the ramp into the next problem, having visibly forgotten that her own rescue was an event at all, composed a final field amendment and kept it. Because some entries are true at a length the Atlas cannot print, they will not stop being this. Rescue is not the end of it. There is no end of it. It is not a response to emergency. It is what they are, and emergencies are merely where the rest of us get to see it. They lifted the 4 from the wreck that same afternoon, in weather the cutter's own manual called non-flyable, on coordinates recited from a Vesca clerk's memory and corrected off a dead man's declination tables, and Marosef's brother came up the ramp on a stretcher with frost-ruined feet and his hands moving, alive, signing his brother's name over and over into the rotor-blasted air, and the company of the Corvelle stood crowded at the cutter's ports as the world fell away. The slot, the apron, the burial terrace, the long invisible thread of their march down across the white, and the last thing any of them saw of Vale through the closing storm was the mast. Upright, guide, transmitting into the murk on its tireless schedule, the loudest thing on the silent planet, a 40-meter iron throat shouting in the signature of a dead ship that her people were alive, alive, alive. Tessik's crew had wanted to shut the beacon down by remote before departure. Procedure abhorred a transmitting derelict. Nadia had asked them to leave it running until the picket formally logged every survivor recovered, everyone. The two in the ice of the Combs and the moraine included, in the spring, by named expedition, and Commander Tessik had looked at her for a moment and then keyed the override herself and entered the request into the record. In the precise language of Cordon law, beacon to remain active. Souls aboard not yet all accounted for, account open. Ostrom read the line over her shoulder and lowered his head plates flat and said nothing, because the account was in surplus and there was nothing a purser could add. The strangeness of survival, Ilian discovered, was that it kept happening. He had somehow expected an ending, a line ruled across the page, totals beneath. Instead, there was a medical bay on a cordon cutter, and then a hospital ring at the picket station, and then weeks of the body presenting its invoices one by one. The toes he kept and the two he did not, the cold scared patches on his arms where the drain had held him, the way his blood, for a full season afterward, ran obedient and thin in warm rooms as if it no longer trusted any of them. The company of the Corvell scattered the way companies do, and did not scatter at all. The Seth brothers went home to their tax office of a world, and Maro's first letter arrived before Ilian had left the hospital ring, dictated because his eyes were still healing, asking whether the Atlas man had filed the amendments yet, and if not, why not, and including, typed by some bemused clerk, a Seth merchant's notarized witness statement, 11 pages, in case the Atlas required testimony that snow could be a building. Ushel returned to his wet world with a commendation and a crate of spare humidity masks built to Eli's field pattern, which a Hoddle medical guild was, to Eli's enduring embarrassment, attempting to name after him. Tova took a posting at the picket station itself, structural assessment, where the pay was poor and the school was good. Pim, asked by a station teacher to draw her home, produced a picture of a snow cave with 14 figures inside it and a mast above it, and refused all suggested corrections, and was right to. Vel Ostrom retired from the ferry line and did not retire at all. He registered a foundation. He explained it to Ilian, in the hospital ring, with the new ledger already open, in the tone of a purser correcting a 40-year error in the books. An endowment for survival training, the human kind, the boring kind, rope drills and watch rotas, and melt discipline and the rest step, to be taught to mix crews on every route that crossed within 10 degrees of a closed world. He had calculated, he said, the cost per life of the Corvell's march down to the biscuit, and compared it to the cost per life of every rescue armada in Cordon history, and the figures were not close, and he intended to spend his remaining decades making that discrepancy famous. The Foundation's charter bore a name in formal trade that translated precisely to the account stays open, and its seal, which Ostrom had commissioned without telling anyone, was a small engraved image of a mast. And in the spring, the picket station spring, when Vale's long white broke and the planet's sky opened like a ledger for one brief season, recovery expedition went back, exactly as a frost-burned loadmaster had promised a silent rope line over a blue hole in the combs that nobody else had believed survivable at the time. Commander Tessik flew it herself, off the books, on accumulated leave, with a volunteer crew that included one human medic, one human loadmaster, one Drosk with a foundation to publicize, and one Vesca annotator with new instruments and old debts. They homed on their own mast, still standing, still transmitting, 6 months of the worst weather in the registered galaxy logged in its strain gauges, a dataset, Tessik said, that the engineering guilds would fight over for a decade. They found Bren's grave by its coordinates, the stone splinter still upright at its head, and brought the captain up out of the wind slab with honors spoken in 5 languages. They rigged a recovery tripod over a certain crevasse in the combs, and Nadia Rook went down headfirst into the blue with a lamp on her wrist one. More time, and Rel of the Quen came home to his gentle plains at last, to a family that had been sent, months before, a copy of a purser's ledger page recording 3 hours and 40 minutes of point work without one mistake. Elian walked the route's first kilometer again, on the spring expedition's last day, from the burial terrace down across the apron, in the strange, soft, almost apologetic light of Vale's brief summer, when the plateau pretended to be merely terrible, and stood a long time at the spot where a human hand had once closed on his harness and found that what he felt was not what he had braced for. Not dread, though the dread was in him forever now, a unit of measure, a calibration no clerk of the Atlas had ever owned before him. What he felt, looking down 90 kilometers of survived white, was the thing he finally had the entry for. The planet had not been defeated. That was the point his profession had been missing for 2 centuries. That was as the correction. Vale was exactly what the Atlas said it was. Incompatible, murderous, closed. Every rating was accurate. And a school bus species from a world with worse Februaries had crossed it anyway, on foot, with everyone they could carry, not because the numbers were wrong, but because the numbers were only ever half the entry. The other half, the half the Atlas had been filing under transcription error for 200 years, walked back up the apron beside him in a patch parka, checking the sky out of habit, and said, "Wind's turning. We should lift in an hour." And he said, "Yes, Loadmaster," and they went home. The hull of the Meridian Atlas did not change for anyone, and it had not changed for Ilian Var. It was as he had left it 2 years before. The long daylit galleries, the smell of fixative and old polymer, the scriptorium's ranked desks where apprentices bent over copywork and learned to hate, as he had hated, the discipline that would someday be the only map they had. He came back to it with 2 fingers missing, a survivor's pension he had declined, an honorific from the Quen he had not declined, and a satchel of field notes that the intake clerk weighed in her hand with open disbelief, because annotators did not return from proscribed worlds, because annotators were not field officers, because the Atlas had no procedure for marginalia written inside its own closure band. The review board convened in the autumn. It was not the climactic tribunal of the entertainments. It was 11 tired senior annotators at a horseshoe table with his filings projected behind them, and it lasted 4 days, and Ilian, who had once been unable to address 3 instructors without his heart's knocking, testified for 9 hours in total and was not afraid at any point because the board, for all its gravity, was not a katabatic wind, and he had spent a season learning what fear was actually for. They struck down his grand amendment, the long one, the one about warehouses and verdicts. He had expected that. The Atlas did not print philosophy, but the rest went on to the permanent record, entry by entry, in the formal hand of the institution itself, and Ilian stood in the gallery on publication day and watched the new pages go live, across 11 species chart rooms at once. Vale, Meridian Atlas, Closure 10, classification unchanged, appended the first successful unsupported surface crossing in the body's records, party of 15, mixed registry, on foot, route annexed as Survey Supplement 1, the Rook Line. Appended further against 4 decades of silence, shelter chain serviceable, S4 accepted. Meltwater channels live in all seasons south of the Bellows. Survey cartography declination corrections A. Bren adopted in full. The dead captain had become posthumously a contributing surveyor of the Meridian Atlas. Ilian had walked that filing through 3 committees himself and counted it, of everything, his proudest. And the entry for Earth, the entry 3 review boards had failed to tame. The taxonomic failure, the door with 9 billion people behind it, gained 1 line, 1. He had drafted 40 versions through the winter, each colder and more careful than the last. The version the board ratified was the shortest, and it was Pym's, though only Ilian would ever know that, and it sat now and forever in the appendix beneath resident species. See environment, where every clerk of every species would copy it by hand for the next 200 years. Note: the environment is survivable in company of the residents. They share. On the day the pages went live, a transit packet arrived for Ilian at the hall, a thin parcel, ferry-class postage, no note. Inside was a coil of climbing rope, worn, frost-scared, 11 meters of it, the lead's end section. He recognized it instantly, of the line that had walked from the Corvelle to the mast. One end had been whipped with new cord and tagged in a familiar level hand, for the next clerk who has to carry the map, NR. He hung it on the wall of the scriptorium, over the copy desks, where the apprentices complained about it daily and asked about it eventually. And when they asked, he would put down his stylus and tell them about a world the Atlas had closed and the people it had been closed to, about a wall breaking in a storm in the middle of a funeral, about snow that was a building and wind that was a slope and a species that audited fear, like freight, and walked and walked and walked. And the apprentices would look up at 11 meters of frayed rope, the way he had once looked at a green light in a gutted room. His transfer posting came through the following year, the first of its kind the hall had ever processed. Field annotator, 2nd class, assigned to a human cordon survey vessel working the closure margins, where the charts lied most, and the company, the request had specified, would be predominantly Earth Registry. The intake clerk who processed it told him, not unkindly, that he was mad, that everyone knew what humans did at the edges of the map, that they walked into places the Atlas had spent 2 centuries fencing shut, and that a Vesca who shipped with them would spend his whole career cold, terrified, and out of his depth. Yes, Ilian said and signed, and his hand was steady because she was entirely right, And because he had learned on 90 kilometers of ice what to do with all three of those conditions. Clip in, count your steps, and keep walking, the account stays open.